Excellent. Welcome, and thanks for having us here. We're going to get started with our first panel. I'm joined here by three incredible participants who have really shown the world how clinical trials data sharing can happen successfully. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order by last name, and I think there's a slide to show who these individuals are one by one. I'm going to start with Dr. Steve Kern, who is the Deputy Director of Quantitative Sciences at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a group focused on quantitative analysis to support program strategies for therapeutic projects that the foundation funds. Prior to this, he was the global head of pharmacology modeling at Novartis. Our second panelist is Dr. Najat Khan, the Chief Data Science Officer and Global Head at Janssen's R&D Strategy and Operations. She has been rocketing up the leadership at J&J in the past 4 years. Prior to that was in consulting at BCG. Dr. Khan has a PhD in organic chemistry from the University of Pennsylvania. Janssen and J&J, we're going to learn, is one of the best at sharing clinical trials data through portals. And as noted in her interview with Endpoints, Dr. Khan is uniquely bilingual in two key languages, the science of drug development as well as data sciences. And then we have Dr. Harlan Krumholtz, cardiologist and scientist at Yale University and Yale New Haven Hospital. He's the Harold Hines Jr. Professor of Medicine and Director of the Center for Outcomes Research and Evaluation. And important for today's discussion, he is the principal investigator for the Yale University Open Data Access, or YODA project, a portal where clinical trials data is shared. And as of this morning, there are 412 trials shared at his portal. My name is Atul Bute, and I'm the Chief Data Scientist across the 12 hospitals, 6 academic health centers, and 7 million patients making up the University of California Health System. I'm a professor and institute director at UCSF, and I'm also technically a pediatrician. And relevant to this panel, I'm also the principal investigator for the NIAID import, where we share with the public data from a few hundred clinical studies and trials for which NIAID was involved. So let's get right into this now that you know our panelists. And I'm going to tee this up with a minute or two of discussion and get right into questions for the panels here. So there's data sharing, and then there's data sharing. Some people think that publishing a paper in an open access journal is data sharing. Some people think that making more tables available in their supplemental materials is data sharing. But more and more, we know that sharing data means sharing the raw data or the products of our research. The molecular world seems to have already figured this out. Gene expression data, DNA sequence data, proteomics data, immunology data, molecular structural data all have an established home, and many journals require that data to be shared. And many researchers have even figured out how to build successful careers using those measurements. But it seems to be much harder to get to data sharing in the clinical world, and especially the world of clinical trials. To me, it seems to be a world of differences, delays, and discrepancies. For example, and some of these were pointed out by Rob Califf, there seems to be a difference right now between sharing data from academic institutions and industry researchers. There seems to be a difference right now in sharing data from a successful trial compared to a failed trial. You define those however you wish. There seems to be a difference in sharing data from a clinical trial on a pill that costs 50 cents compared to sharing data from a clinical trial for a drug that's going to cost $1 million. And there seems to be a difference in sharing whether you're a vetted investigator asking for the data compared to whether you are a citizen scientist asking for this data. There shouldn't be differences in any of these, but there are actually differences here. And then when clinical trials data is actually stored and shared, these data can be shared with a little or a lot of relevant clinical data. Now, there are a lot of different points of data and parts of data and data sets. There's clinical data, there's claims data, but most of what we're going to be talking about here is clinical trials data and sharing individual level clinical trials data with the public. And if we have time, we can get those other types of data as well. We have so many reasons why people say no to sharing data, right? The clinical trials data seems to have competitive value to people, to institutions. Having competitors access our data seems to be a threat, or threatening at least, and does seem to cost money and take resources to share data, to get it into the right formats, for example. And then of course, the ubiquitously uttered word HIPAA, or acronym HIPAA, seems to slow things down. So we have so many reasons why people say no. How do we get to routes to get to people to say yes? So I'd like to start with our three panelists. How did you get your organizations to yes? How did you get your institutions to agree to sharing data? Or how did you get your institutions to convince others to share data with you? I wanna start with Najat, and then we'll get to Harlan and then Steve. So let's turn this over to Najat first. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's always great question. How did we get our institution to say yes? I mean, I think the first point, which Dr. Rob Califf also alluded to in his presentation, at the end of the day, it is about patients, right? And about the value we can drive by having data that's shared, accelerating some of the insights that we can find. And especially as a data scientist, I can tell you without that, there's such limited things that we can do. So it all started by selecting certain pockets where we said, look, we have a lot of really good clinical trial data, let's say multiple myeloma, like areas that we've done a lot of research in. And for the benefit of the patients, this is an area that we could start sharing. So starting a little bit smaller, showing the value, while balancing some of the risks or concerns, Atul, that you mentioned. There's risks around, I mean, one of the things that we worry the most around is just rogue analyses, right? Because that's not done in a responsible way, responsible science. And I think, what Harlan has done with Yoda and Project Data Sphere and other, having that sort of governance to ensure that when you do share the data, that the work that's being done in addition to that is done in a responsible way. I think that has been a route, and being thoughtful about that to success for us. And, the other thing I'll also say is the timing of when it's shared, right? There are always considerations around regulatory and patient privacy. You alluded to that. So how do we find a middle ground instead of saying share all data or share no data, to have the right checks and balances in place and having right, institutions like Yoda and others that actually make it happen. And then you can see good examples of that happening. We benefit from it. Others in the community benefit from it. So again, with everything in life, doing it in a thoughtful way, having very specific proof points, and then there's more openness as an organization to do it.
Great answers. And we're going to get to rogue analysts as we go through the panel here, because they can be reporters, they can be academics, they can be potential threats here. Let's move right to Harlan. How have you been so successful with Yoda? Not just convincing folks to build it, but getting the folks to contribute data.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say that a terrific talk by Rob. Appreciate those questions, and really Yoda's should be crediting J&J, because and Joanne Waldstreich are really at the top of J&J, who believed in this idea of data science. I will say that original IOM meeting that Rob referenced, Joe Ross and I went to the IOM advocating for that meeting. Actually, we had funding for that meeting that had come through Medtronic, who we'd convinced to share data when they were being assailed for one of their products. And then the IOM was getting pressure to circumscribe that meeting, to focus it more on pre-competitive data sharing and sharing animal studies for controls, and not the kind of data sharing that Rob was discussing. And we had a little break with them, honestly, over it, because a lot of the industry sponsors felt that they wanted to circumscribe what that meeting was going to be about. When we pulled at first, then the reaction was actually to expand again, and it ultimately became that meeting with a broader purpose. And I began talking with Joanne at J&J about, if you guys are true to your credo, will you jump in and lead with this idea of data sharing? And Joanne, to her great credit, and not easy within an organization like J&J, because there's a sort of natural conservatism around, making leadership moves in the area of sharing what that was considered by many in the organization as their own asset, and really was able to populate much of what Yoda has. As Rob said, we're not just about J&J, but really most of the trials we're sharing at this point are J&J trials, and we have got a process in place to ensure that it's done in a responsible way. But let me say, you discount this idea of people publishing or even putting data in their supplement. We also have to recognize that we're in an era of immense publication bias. The studies that we've done of all trials registered in clinicaltrials.gov that are finished, all trials that are done within academic medical centers, all trials that are sponsored by the NIH, it tops out at about 60-65% that are ever published or reported. And lots of medical centers, you've got investigators who finish the experiment on human beings and never even share that result. So we have to realize we got a ways to go even on the most basic things. And then the delay, we launched a preprint server, medRxiv, to try to get information out. Peter Bach, let's talk about oncology, published an article where he said the time from press release, so the sort of SEC required press release, to publication in oncology, the median was a year. So we think about these national meetings where there's simultaneous publications and everything goes fast, but the median was a year. And that meant that for a whole year, there was a press release, but no real information, no artifact of that in a preprint or on clinicaltrials.gov. So we've got some basic sharing, just even of results. I mean, the results are data too, and that's not occurring, not creating artifacts, not moving us fast enough. And then we've got this situation where for most investigators, there isn't the funding or the inclination or the motivation to be able to be as a foundation for the next studies that follow. And meanwhile, you're an investigator and you're looking around the corner and you're seeing that they're large data aggregators. Like everyone's data seems to be everywhere. We've got a spigot to Flatiron, for example. All of our data every day in almost real time goes to Roche from Yale. But as an investigator, it's very hard to get a hold of that data. So we send it to Roche every day. By the way, we pay Roche to do that. We pay them for a quality report, and then they get it, and they get to resell it to Pfizer. They did. They sold it to Pfizer, and they're selling it around. Our data with full identifiers, complete and comprehensive. As an investigator, if I go to them to say to Yale, I'd like a complete download of all the oncology data for the last 5 years because I've got a lot of good ideas, they say, you're crazy, stand in line at the IRB. We'll take 6 months to approve it. And then we'll put you in line with our data technicians. That'll take another 8 months to download it to you. And then it'll be old. Meanwhile, in real time, we have a stream going to Flatiron. Meanwhile, Komodo says they've got data records on 320 million Americans. Same with Optum, same with all of these have. So we've got this weird world going on now where on the business side, a lot of the data is just is out there. I don't know where my data is. If I ask Yale, where did you send my data? They actually can't give me an accounting of it. And I don't say that I love my institution. I think my institution is one of the top, most sophisticated IT institutions in the world. But this is the state of the art. And Atul, you know this very well. This is the state of the art at the very best places. And so how do we start to be thinking about bringing all of this back under control, reining in what are the general operating procedures that we believe that most respects patients, agency, and autonomy, and pushes forward the lines of research and gets us in a different state here where we can both share results. I'll just say finally, because I know it's taking so much time, but a lot of what we're driving to is around improving the reproducibility of research. There's a lot of work that's being done that suggests that our work, and I would say in a lot of realms, is there are questions about its reproducibility, which leads to uncertainty about what the underlying relationships are and who should be treated with what. And so we're trying to drive to a state where we can get there. And finally, Atul, you didn't ask about this, but I think sharing code is an important part of this. I fear that a lot of studies that are out there have had mistakes in code, but you can't tell it from the study. And the only way to do it is for have people have it more transparent and share. We're starting to post code now so that we do a study, especially we do a study on a database that people can get. We want the next group to be able to start with our code. And by the way, if we've made a mistake, tell us. We've gone through it, we've done our best. We have a lot of quality control, but this is the only way we're going to be able to continue to make progress.
All right, so great points there, and I'll just highlight a couple here about reporting results. That a lot of results never get reported. You got brought up the business side of this, especially all these new companies. We'll get to those, and then reproducibility as a motivator. I'm going to push on that one, but not yet, because we're going to hear from Steve next. Go for it.
Yeah, thanks. And Harlan, you just teed up the whole plethora of issues around this, which is awesome. Really, really great to hear. And Najat, I appreciate your comments to start this off. I mean, we as a funder, so the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we're of course interested in sharing. Now, I was hired into the organization in 2013 under the auspices to model the data. What a surprise to show up in 2013 and say, we don't have the data, it's with all our investigators. And so then people we've funded won't give us the data so that we can make decisions on the next thing to fund. Sound crazy? It is crazy, right? So that's the goal of one of the things we're trying to work with other funders and move this field in the right direction. Because we are risky investors, right? We like to take risks on things in the hope that they'll actually pitch out. And so that's one of the challenges we find. Around the time that the ICMJE did their data sharing initiative, we joined an initiative with a number of funders to say data's got to be made available and open for publications on research we funded. We put that in as a requirement. 2 years later, Ben Goldacre did a survey and held us to task because we weren't doing a very good job, just like the publishers weren't doing a very good job as well in following through on that. And so, we got to this conundrum of, I'm going to steal the phrase you used, the tool that I loved in your JAMA editorial, of sharper sticks or sweeter carrots. What's going to be the direction, right? And so sharper sticks, okay, we can tell people no more funding until you put your data in place. But in fact, that's probably just going to create a bunch of garbage going into dumps that then nobody uses and people checking boxes. So we went the sweeter carrots approach. And what we started to do was get on the front end of studies and say at the beginning, as we're starting the study, we want you to share the data. We want to work with you and figure out where you're going to put the data now before we collect it. Oh, and we want to simulate your trial before you start it to see what the probability of success is. And gosh, when we do that, guess what? We get a data collection form so that you can use in that data repository. And we also get a statistical analysis plan. So when the study's done and all the data is collected, you just have to push a button and the result comes out. And then after you see the result, you push another button and the rest of the world can see it. I mean, it is literally that simple. And the best study came out of your institution, actually, that we had been involved in, the Mordor study, which was an assessment of neonatal infant mortality, pediatric mortality with prophylaxis azithromycin in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the greatest things was that they were able to essentially have that analysis of the data done very quickly and then available for us to be able to see, now moving out into an open repository. So we realize as funders that, we have to fund this so that it's feasible for investigators to do, right? And we don't do it at the beginning. If we do it at the end when everybody's wrapping it up and wanting to go on to the next thing, nobody has interest. So it's really important to get out in the front end of that component. And then that helps, to Harlan's point about reproducibility, because if we do a study and we fund it and we have a result, then NIH's next study ought to be a brick on top of ours, not a brick alongside of ours. And Wellcome's ought to come on top of that. And our partner J&J should be actually a next component that adds to that. So I think that's exactly the efforts we're trying to pull forward. I'll just say quickly that in COVID, what we did was we stood up this workbench called ICOTA, and Frank Rockrold, I see his smile, is one of our board members on this, along with Marty Murphy from the CEO Roundtable. And its purpose is just that. What you leave behind are the results, a pointer to the raw data, and the scripts. So anybody can come in and actually rerun it, recheck it, redo it, build it, learn from it, go forward, right? That's the only way we're going to really make good progress.
Wow, great points. Okay, so a lot of emphasis on the process here too, especially from the funding side, right? To get all this locked up first, because you're absolutely right. At the end of the study, it's, a lot of these seem to be dependent on that lone postdoc. And once that postdoc leaves, nobody knows what these files are. And of course, the names are, version 2, version 3, and of course, nobody knows anything. So absolutely right. Lock it down early and get those details done often. Let's get right into one of the first points. So what about uses and users of these data sets, right? Raw data by itself on a website, no matter how open, doesn't get us anywhere, right? We need to have users of these data sets to actually create that value that we're all anticipating is going to happen here. But we have this threat, and Najat brought up right away about rogue analysts here, right? And rogue analysts sound like some type of criminal element. It doesn't even have to be that. It has been almost exactly 5.5 years since Jeff Drazen had his paper in New England Journal of Medicine indicating research parasites. Okay, so perhaps there's a continuum there. But the reality is we literally do have folks right now looking through MedWatch data, looking and highlighting side effects of COVID vaccines, right? They're people actually trying to do this. We don't even need fancy new ways to share data to see the effect of rogue analysts right now and how they can, what they think they see can be highlighted. So the question I have for these esteemed panelists is, how do we show the world the benefits of sharing raw participant level clinical trials data, how do we show that the benefits outweighs these detracting issues? And I'm also going to argue, shouldn't research results be so robust and resilient to actually compensate for rogue analysts? Let's go backwards. Maybe Steve, start with you.
Yeah, that's a real interesting point. I mean, I think if we have the systems in place so that anybody can rerun those analyses, following on what Harlan had mentioned originally, right? Then we've got a check and balance system against that. So if somebody wants to game the results by pulling out the things that they like, which happens on a regular basis in not necessarily in science, but in the broader community at large, then there's a way to check that and to be able to look at that relative to the other amounts of data that are present. I mean, one of the things that I've been using as just my metric when I think about effective therapeutics is just that simple estimate of something like numbers needed to treat, right? When you talk about numbers needed to treat to a lay audience, they start to understand this idea that some people are going to get medicine that probably didn't need it. And the question is, how many do you have to treat before you save one, right? And then the other number with that is number needed to harm. And if those numbers are close to one another, you don't have an effective medicine. If they're way apart, you have an effective medicine. So I think those are conceptual ideas that a lay audience can get their hands around. And it starts to give people a way to interpret some of these results so that they're not swayed.
No, great points here. Harlan, what do you think? I mean, who are the users of Yoda right now? What are they doing? How sure are you in terms of what they're doing?
Well, I can tell you what we do to try to put some guardrails on, but maybe this is important to understand how science works, which is, I really love this quote from one of Francis Collins' books where he describes science as progressive and self-correcting. And the notion is, I think, that even with the same data, we may not all agree. I mean, it may come to different conclusions. You have an esteemed person like John Ioannidis who saw data at the beginning of the pandemic and interpreted it in a single way. I would never call John a rogue investigator. He's one of the most skilled interpreters of data there is. I may not have agreed with him, but I do think that he's got the skills to be a scientist and to make his interpretations. Brian Nosek did a classic experiment, a psychologist from the University of Virginia, where he sent around the same data set to a bunch of very competent data scientists, and the question was, were referees in soccer matches more likely to give red cards to people of color? And he had all the data together and he gave it to them. And I think it was like 39, 40 different groups. And no one came up with the same result. And ranging from people who said there was an extreme bias to finding no significant bias to a bunch of people in the middle. And then he looked at subgroups. How about by the skill level of the group, the number of publications they had, who was involved in doing this, and it didn't predict what the results would be. And so I think this idea is that many people we need to be looking at it in lots of different directions, and we need to be making progress together. But there may not be a single right answer. There's lots of assumptions within any research, and so what we need to do is start pulling out what assumptions lead and what methodological approaches lead to one result versus another. Now, this was in an observational study, an experiment that's conducted, I think has a little tighter bounds about what the result is, but still someone can then apply Bayesian analysis when it was done in a frequentance model as the beginning of the process. I've seen multiple reanalyses of trials that have brought different perspectives. We should embrace that. We should embrace it. Now, I think when we talk about rogue, if someone comes in with an agenda that's seeking to do harm, that's one thing. But if someone's seeking to do science, I think we ought to accept the fact that there can be disparate opinions. And in fact, that might be something good to understand what's driving things in one or the other. Just to get to the IOTA thing, for example, is what we agreed with for J&J trials, that there would be an application, and the application wouldn't be making the judgment about whether we were in favor or not of the question. And J&J we said, we want to be arm's length. We do not want to be in the decision-making process, but we want you, Yale, to make sure that there's a scientific question here, that the person who's posing it actually can pre-specify what they're doing. Even if they're doing exploratory analyses, declare that. So that way somebody doesn't go in, p-hack, and come out as if that was the original idea from the outset. And I think there are a lot of things we can be doing in science to strengthen our approach around pre-specification. Is this an experiment or a data experiment, even on observational data we're conducting? Are we just doing exploratory? What is it we want to do? And then we said people need to commit to giving the answers, like show what was your result and so forth. So, but I think that making the data available in part is about saying someone can make a claim and I can go in there, just as Steve said, and check it. And so it's not a mystery of saying black box, just trust me, here's what I found.
Yeah, I mean, I do.
Great answers. John, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think great answers. And what I would say is like, look, at the end of the day, it's getting into because to your question was, how do we show up as a good example, right, to actually promote data sharing? And I think a lot of it comes in terms of our own internal practices of setting that bar super high. I completely agree with Harlan, like, having different opinions that, and actually insinuates a really good dialogue. But, internally, for instance, at J&J, we have one platform now where we have all of our internal data sets, even external, Harlan, like you were saying, some of the external data. Everything is in one place. There's an audit trail for every analysis that's done. There's a protocol. There's a internal committee review. Things are pre-specified in terms of what we're going to, so you can't cherry pick later on whatever cut you wanted. And so you create like the next set of data scientists, that this is how you work. And if you do that, then we can show, and we have been showing really good examples of where data sharing, we've actually have data sets from others and we've done high quality work. And I just think that having institutions like Yoda and the checks and balances is really, really important. But if we don't have our own folks starting with a really, really high bar, then we can't expect others to do so. And then the other point is there's always going to be other analysis that's done. Like, I live in a world of what's my fixed control and not. And if we have a very high bar in terms of what we're doing, then I think it's probably the only way to counteract some of the other things that happen. But I think it just starts in your own house, and then how do you set the right guidelines so that it's done well across the board.
Okay, great answers here. And I think it should be reassuring to folks. There is a way through all these threats and rogue analysis. I want to switch gears here. We're going to run out of time pretty soon, I think, in the next 10 minutes or so. So we're going to get into more rapid fire mode here. Let's talk about the business world of this, because Rob brought it up, called out Harlan and my institutions for making money. Of course, health systems make money, providers make money, so do pharmaceutical companies. There is a business side to the practices of medicine, certainly in the United States. Now, we have this new world of real world data industrial partners. And just to highlight a couple, of course, Flatiron has been mentioned several times, acquired by Roche. Verana raised $100 million last year. Anumana raised $25 million Series A a couple weeks ago out of Mayo. Inference, I think, raised $20 million out of Mayo. Truveta, $95 million Series A. Edion, $110 million Series C. Datavant and Ciox, $7 billion merging. Trinetics, $40 million Series D. Explorers acquired by IBM in 2015. And on and on and on. These are hundreds of millions to billions now. Question for the panel. Does having more and more of these companies actually showing a dollar amount on the value of this data help or hurt our data sharing efforts? All of a sudden, why share? Because there seems to be money here. I'm not sure where this field is going to go with these companies. Of course, those with money can pay these companies to get the data. The rest of us are stuck, just like Harlan said. Roche has easier access to his clinical data than he does. Harlan, let's start with you.
Well, I think it's just showing, the dynamics of the current environment and where the incentives are. I mean, this money is being spent because there's an ROI on it, right? But people have an expectation that the value is going to be drawn, and the value is not just in this case, most of these companies, ATN aside, but most of the ones you said are purveyors and data aggregators who are then making it available to others who think that they can gain value on it. And it moves data away from being a public good to one that's firmly within the private enterprise sector. And I think there's something broken about companies that can say we have 320 million records. So I wonder how many companies have my records, for example. Like, I no idea, and sort of hide behind the business associate agreements, which then let data leak from all the health systems, and then have it in a secondary market under a rubric of de-identification. But we all know that all this stuff can be re-identified really easily if anyone has the will to do it. And so I think it's about trying to envision a future that both provides for the groups that are going to add value to data. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I have this level of discomfort about the data being aggregated, organized, sold for massive sums. But and I would say my own institution, as far as I know, isn't making a dime off of any of the transactions, but their data is leaking through the business associate agreements every day. And this thing with Flatiron is a legal arrangement whereby Yale had bought a service from Flatiron. In exchange, Flatiron says, we need all of your oncology data to provide this service, a quality report. And then Flatiron's free through the business associate agreement, now Roche, to be able to then resell, do whatever they want with that data. And yet the scientists, like at least scientists even within our own institution, don't have access to it. So, I think that this is that all this money's going around, all these companies are being founded and so forth, that, should give us pause to think about what's the ideal ecosystem. Again, like inference, I believe, is trying to add value, right? So there's like, if we get the data, we think we can do something on top, but some of the companies are just simply purveyors of the data. And I think that can add additional friction to the process because they need to get paid a certain amount because they've aggregated through these backdoor practices. And we need to deal with that, I think.
It's such a
okay, so Najat, please. I think maybe you know some of these companies.
very well, but I mean, here's the thing: it's a challenging question. But where my head goes to is, okay, like Harlan, what you said, inference using the metadata, trying to create value for patients, right? Predicting who's at risk, whatever the questions might be, right? Like better patient stratification for IBD. I mean, there's so many questions we haven't answered forever. That's where my head goes. Okay, in order to answer those questions, what as a data scientist do I need to do to get there? Unfortunately, a lot of the real world data, if you go institution to institution, when you get down to the exact number of patients that you want, you apply your inclusion, exclusion, the N becomes small. And then in order to add that value, analyses are just hard to do. I won't believe them, right? If they're statistically not rigorous. And, let's not even talk about machine learning because that doesn't even come to the foreground. And so to do that, we do need a more integrated, ideal state one health system where you can actually, the checks and balances so that the analysis you're doing is for patient value. But the challenge is if we don't have these companies, it's really hard to even do these analyses to add value. I mean, Atul, you're rare in a way that, the UC Berkeley and just UCSF system has connected all of the different data sets. So you have a good denominator to begin with. So that's what I struggle with, quite frankly, because I agree with Harlan. I don't know where my data sets are. I mean, they're de-identified. That's true. But at the same time, if we don't have something like that, then, the UK system is so different, right? Think about the rapid analysis you can do, but that's because the foundational nature of how the data sets are and the infrastructure is created. We just don't have that here. So I think it's a challenging question, but my head goes to responsibly answering questions that add value to patients. And if this helps to get that as an enabler, it is what it is.
Yeah, and I would argue that they help in the sense that they're creating new ways that we can combine the data. So they keep getting better at technology solutions. They reinforce this idea it's not a technology problem we have here. We're really struggling with a problem around governance and will in a lot of ways. But I'll go back that, we don't even necessarily need that. I mean, you'll hear the last session today is a really interesting group of patients that self-organized to share data, not with anybody's help, but just themselves, right? So, and last week in Science, there was this great paper that was published on speed of metabolism over the duration of your life by a whole bunch of investigators self-organizing to combine all of their label studies from metabolic impact studies to basically say, here's what the picture tells us together. So we know what the value can be. We know the technology is there. I think if we can actually get that data organized in a useful way, then let the market churn on who's better at finding those insights and selling their knowledge and their cleverness, not their access and their barriers to data.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
I will just say one other thing about the transparency is if we're going to be using data from the aggregators, I don't think we can just say this was the Komodo database. Like, whose data was it and how was it mapped? As Tool knows, and Jay, all of you know, that the mapping, the pre-processing, that's other areas where things get introduced. And instead, we're basically told this is the Optum database. And it's like, okay. Surgisphere went down because somebody called the hospital and said, did you give data to Surgisphere? And the hospital said, never heard of them before. But, if you call Yale and say, did you give data to Optum or to Komodo, they'll say never heard of them, or didn't, not that I know of, but they haven't. So it's like, we need to be able to have a layer of transparency about these large data sets that we're using, so we know where did they come from, what kind of pre-processing. That can't be proprietary, because otherwise, you know, we're just accepting on faith. We don't even know where it's from.
And so can I just build on something that Stephen mentioned, which is really important in terms of the model where patients are actually sharing their own data, but ensuring there's an infrastructure that enables you to do that. I mean, there are companies like Allstripes, for instance, looking at, you know, rare disease patients and actually taking a completely different way of doing it, directly coming from patients. Actually, it's a great way to engage a community that has huge unmet need, but they benefit. And I think Rob Califf also said that in his presentation, which is, how are we thinking about how do these data sets benefit, or any analysis we do benefit the patient from the perspective of the patient, not the perspective of the pharma company or an academic. I mean, that's also another angle that we need to look at. So I do like companies like that are coming up as really directly from patients. And there it's really important to have an easy to use infrastructure. So there are companies, a new wave of companies that are also doing that. So just wanted to point that out. And I think
no, it's a great point. In fact, that's one of the questions that came up from the audience. I'm going to start to draw some of those in here. Tokenization, blockchain. Is that going to make a difference here? We got Luna DNA. We've got a couple of these companies out trying to empower people to even try to monetize their own data. Is it long-term coming, or is it short-term? What do you think?
I mean, on the tokenization point, I'll just touch on that one and not the full list. But, you know, on tokenization, so let's take all of our clinical trial studies that we do, right? I think we all agree that data sharing has huge benefits. But when I think about long-term outcomes, you know, right now we start going into real world data, but it's not really like for like patients. There's always can be biases. How about if we could just tokenize those patients, opt in, right? It's completely optional, so it's not something that's, you know, mandated, and then actually follow the patients and look at the long-term outcomes. We actually did that for a COVID-19 vaccine program. It's the first example ever in history to actually tokenize, and we did it for US patients because, you know, again, all of the right privacy has to be in there. It's in the informed consent, etc. And we have over 7,000 patients that opted in. And I remember, why is that important? Because instead of going to data aggregators and saying, what do I think is happening? You can augment that data by following your own patients and determining the long-term outcome. I do think that it's something that the industry is going to move to going forward, just being done in the right way. But I see there's huge potential in that, because at the end of the day, again, benefits patients.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love, in fact, a lot of comments already in the chat about your model, that it's got to benefit the patient in the end, right? It's not about the making of money, even on the commercial concept there too. But this model of data sharing, self-data sharing, has been around, and we're empowering patients to do more and more because we give more and more of that data. One can argue maybe we charge for it, maybe it's better or worse coming through digital apps, FHIR formats, things like that. I think that's certainly a new world that's going to be growing. We have 4 minutes left, and I'm going to ask a rapid fire question about motivators again. And this came up from several of the folks asking questions. We have many potential motivators and motivations here, right? And some have already come up. We have, for example, journals and their requirements as motivators. We have the Gates Foundation, NIH, and funders as a motivator. We have new reproducibility rules as a motivator. We have patients wanting help for their own condition, rare or otherwise, as a motivator. Maybe even patients wanting to monetize their data as a motivator. And then, of course, we have FDA and federal law as a motivator. If you had to pick one of these as the one to invest in the next 3 to 5 years, the motivator that you think is going to work the most, which one do you think it will be? And Najat, you're on my screen. Why don't you go answer first? We'll go through the other two and we'll close it out.
Can I pick a motivator that you didn't list out?
Yes, definitely.
There are many. I just didn't know. No, look, I mean, at the end of the day, the motivator, just so I understand the question, to really drive patient sharing, to me, it's all about value and showing the value creation. Look, I think you're going to get a certain sliver if it's, you know, regulatory or if it's journal or whatever, but we need to advance science. We need to we have so many questions that we've been asking for the last 20 years. This is one way of answering those questions. So to me, it's about actually addressing medical and scientific questions that It's value for patients, and that can be a huge motivator that I think many of us can get behind. I mean, there were questions in terms of who owns the data, right? Like at the end of the day, the patient can get behind it in many different, I think, many different cycles. So that's what I would pick.
Harlan, you want to go next? And then followed up by Steve.
Sure. I mean, I think you know that I've been working hard on trying to tip the balance of power in the research ecosystem. So if we're going to talk about studies that we enroll people, I think get rid of the word subjects, start thinking about partners, and these people who are participating recognize that the need for progress is greatest, among people who are facing the health challenges as they get really part of the clinical trial ecosystem and have more power in the process. It's not like what's going to be a motivator. I think we just need to change normative expectations. The enemy's the disease. It's not, and the competition is competition against disease. And the notion endpoint here is to try to put people in a better position to achieve better health and better health outcomes. And I think that it's really hard to be in a room with a bunch of patients who are partners in the project and start talking about how you're sequestering data and how you're not allowing others to, smart minds around the world, to start thinking and participating and building upon that work to move faster. And so, I think what I would like to build and what, as I'm doing with Hugo, as you know about, is this notion that people can gain more agency over their data, can be participants in studies as equal partners, and have a say over that idea about what happens with the data in the long run. And I think people can participate more than one study. We can increase the cycle time, or we can decrease the cycle time and increase the number of cycles if we can be participating and holding hands with people who are actually facing the health challenges.
All right, Steve, bring us home in the last minute.
I think that's a great point, Harlan, in terms of the patient center and thinking about who we're actually trying to help and serve. That's exactly what all the funders are trying to do too. They're trying to advance science, but they're really trying to help patients who are struggling with some of these issues. I love Najat's add-on of value. And the thing I love about it, Najat, is that everybody, if we do this right, everyone gets value. Everyone gets different value, right? But value comes to everyone. Patients get better care, right? Researchers don't waste their time on experiments that don't work. Investors and funders put their money on projects that actually have some degree of success and hope, right? So there's value for everyone in the system if we can just align these pieces up.
Well, this is great. We're at our time. Please, as an audience, give a virtual hand to our panelists today. I think we got to more agreement than I was thinking we would. Maybe I was hoping we'd argue more, but perhaps agreement's not so bad to launch the day. I'm going to turn it over back to our hosts, who will then bring us into our next panel. So thank you all. Thank you, guys.